Europe, viewed from space at night, reveals a shape that no daytime political map ever shows. A single curved corridor of light runs from southeast England, through Belgium and the Netherlands, across the German Rhineland and Switzerland, and into the industrial north of Italy. It is a crescent of illumination, so consistent and so dense that it stands out from the rest of the continent, the way a neon sign stands out from a dark street. Geographers have a name for this shape. They call it the blue banana, a term coined by the French geographer Roger Brunet in 1989. The blue banana sounds whimsical until its true meaning becomes clear. It is not merely a concentration of lights on a map, but a concentration of almost everything that makes a modern economy function. Inside that curved corridor, covering roughly 3% of Europe's total land area, more than 110 million people live. Those people generate a disproportionate share of the continent's economic output. The corridor houses the headquarters of multinational corporations, the continent's busiest ports, its most connected airports, its densest rail networks, and its most productive manufacturing zones. It is so economically dominant that understanding it means understanding why Europe works the way it does, and why parts of Europe outside the corridor have always struggled to close the gap with the parts inside. And the question the blue banana forces on anyone who examines it seriously is not merely how it came to exist, but whether the forces that created it are still operating, or whether, after 7 decades of European integration, 2 decades of digital transformation, and 1 catastrophic act of political self-separation, the banana is finally beginning to bend. The origins of the blue banana are not recent, and they are not accidental. They reach back to the medieval period, and to a set of geographical advantages that compounded over centuries into the economic dominance visible on the nighttime satellite image today. It begins with water, specifically with the Rhine. The Rhine runs through the heart of the corridor from the Swiss Alps northward through Germany and the Netherlands to the North Sea. For more than 2,000 years, it has been a navigable waterway and the primary commercial artery of Northwest Europe, carrying goods from the Mediterranean world northward and from the northern ports southward with an efficiency that pre-industrial land transport could not approach. The towns that grew along the Rhine and its tributaries prospered because of the trade the river enabled. They accumulated merchants and craftsmen, financial institutions, and manufacturing capacity. River trade, when it operates consistently across generations, builds the commercial infrastructure of cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, Basel, and Rotterdam. Today, those cities remain among the most economically significant urban centers in Europe, their modern wealth a direct inheritance from the medieval trade that the river made possible. But the Rhine is only part of the geographical story because the blue banana's northern anchor is not a river, but a coastline. Specifically the southern coast of the North Sea. There, the ports of London, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg developed over the same centuries into the gateways through which European trade with the rest of the world flowed. Their location at the intersection of the Atlantic Ocean and the European continent gave them access to global commerce that inland cities could not replicate. These were the points where the wealth of empire and the profits of global trade entered the European economic system, and from them they radiated southward and eastward along the trade routes that connected the ports to the continental interior. The corridor those trade routes defined, running roughly from the English Channel through the Low Countries and the Rhineland toward the Alpine passes that linked northern Europe to the Mediterranean world, is the same corridor that the blue banana traces today. The same geographical logic operates at a larger scale and with more sophisticated technology, but it follows the same underlying map that medieval merchants traveled with their feet and their boats over 500 years ago. The Industrial Revolution amplified everything geography had already established. The coal deposits of the English Midlands, the Ruhr Valley, and the Belgian and northern French coal fields happened to sit along or adjacent to the same corridor that trade had already made dense and connected. When steam power transformed manufacturing in the 19th century, industrial capacity concentrated where coal was accessible and markets were already connected. deepening the economic advantage of the blue banana at the moment when industrial strength became a primary determinant of national wealth. The cities of the Ruhr, Essen, Dortmund, and Dusseldorf, and the textile towns of northern England and Belgium grew into industrial giants during this period. They did so not because anyone planned them to, but because geography placed them at the intersection of fuel, market, and transport infrastructure that industrialization required, adding a layer of manufacturing dominance to the commercial dominance medieval trade routes had already established. Here, the story shifts from historical explanation to present uncertainty. The blue banana, as Brunet described it in 1989, was built on a specific set of economic and political conditions. Those conditions have been changing with increasing speed. The European single market lowered barriers to trade and investment across the continent, allowing the corridor's economic dominance to operate at continental scale. The relative decline of heavy industry reduced the coal and steel geography that had anchored parts of the corridor's manufacturing core. The rise of the digital economy, in principle, can locate itself anywhere with good connectivity rather than being bound to the specific geographical advantages of navigable rivers and coal deposits. The eastward expansion of the European Union brought Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into the single market, and it began generating the kind of economic momentum that raises the question of whether a new corridor of European economic dynamism might be forming to the east of the original banana. In 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. That decision removed the northern anchor of the blue banana from the integrated economic system that had given it much of its post-war relevance. The consequences of that removal for the corridor's coherence are still unfolding. London has retained its financial significance through the inertia of accumulated institutional depth, but it lost the frictionless access to the European single market that had reinforced its position as the corridor's northern gateway. That change created a gap at the banana's northern end that no subsequent trade agreement has fully closed, and it represents the most significant structural challenge the corridor has faced since its post-war consolidation. The question of whether the blue banana is breaking apart does not have a clean answer yet. The forces pulling it apart and the forces holding it together are operating simultaneously, and their relative strength will only become clear over the coming decades. The direction of change is not ambiguous. The digital economy is relocating some of the activity that geography used to anchor. Eastern European economies are growing faster than the core corridor economies, and they are beginning to generate the density and connectivity that economic corridors require. Brexit has created a structural discontinuity in the northern anchor, and that discontinuity compounds over time. The energy transition away from fossil fuels is removing one of the last geographical advantages that the coal-bearing regions of the corridor held. The banana that Brunet drew in 1989 looks less inevitable today than it did then, less like a permanent geographical fact and more like a historical formation that specific conditions created and that different conditions might dissolve. That is the most important thing the blue banana teaches. The shapes visible on economic maps are not laws of nature, but accumulations of advantage, built up over centuries by the intersection of geography, trade, technology, and political organization. When any one of those elements shifts significantly, the shape can shift with it. The corridor of light running from London to Milan on the nighttime satellite image is not a permanent feature of the European landscape. It is a record of how European civilization organized itself under a specific set of conditions. Whether those conditions persist or change, whether the banana holds its shape or bends further or breaks entirely, will determine not just where Europeans live and work, but what Europe means as an economic and political project in the century ahead. In the end, a map is never just a picture of where things are, it is a picture of why they got there. And when the why changes, the where always follows.